section. This is the skull. We're going to talk about parts of the skull. And this bump right here, back here, is the external occipital protuberance, or the EOP.
Well, he was this.
Right here's the frontal bone. Parietal bone on the right, parietal bone on the left, and the occipital bone back here. We have sutures. We have the frontal suture, which separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. We have the sagittal suture, which falls along the sagittal plane, separates the two parietal bones. The frontal suture is also more commonly called the coronal suture. Over here between the parietal bones and the occipital bone, we have the lambdoidal suture, or the lambdoid suture. Over here, we have a hole right there, that's basically your ear hole, your external auditory meatus. This bone right here is the temporal bone. There's a suture that goes right here called the squamous suture that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bones. Another feature of the temporal bone is this bump right here called the mastoid process. Another feature of the temporal bone is this thing that sticks down like a stiletto heel, and that's called the styloid process. Another feature of the temporal bone is this process that sticks right out here that's called the zygomatic process, the temporal bone. This zygomatic process of the temporal bone hooks up with the zygomatic process of the zygomatic bone, and they form together, and this makes a zygomatic arch, or your cheekbone. Now up here is your zygomatic bone. We have your upper jaw, or your maxilla. Coming up, your bridge of the nose is the nasal bone. On the inside of your eye is a bone called the lacrimal bone. Inside the nasal cavity right here, we have the middle bone right here. The top bone is part of the ethmoid bone. The bottom half of this is part of the vomer bone. What else do we have on this? We'll open this up. Frontal bone right here. And then we have this process sticking up right here. This is part of the ethmoid bone. And the nub that sticks up right there is called the sella turcica. I'm sorry, that is the sella turcica is right back here. We'll come back to that. And this is the crista galli, meaning it's Cox's comb. On each side of the crista galli is a flat spot, and that is called the cribriform plate. Back here, this wing-shaped bone is called the sphenoid bone, and a feature of that is the sella turcica. On the occipital bone, we have this hole here called the foramen magnum. Now, if we come outside of the orbit of the eye and come below it, we're going inferior to it, we find a hole. Holes are typically called foramen. That is inferior to the orbit of the eye. It's on the maxilla. This foramen that is inferior to the orbit of the eye is called the infraorbital foramen. It's that hole right below the eye. Here I have my lower jaw, probably called your mandible. And if we put our thumbs right on our chin, this process right here is called the mental process. On each side of the mental, you have a hole here and a hole here. They're typically called foramen. This is the mental foramen. The external auditory meatus, we talked about that. Now, if we come to the roof of the mouth, this part of the roof of the mouth is still part of the maxilla. If we come behind here, this is the palatine bone. The palatine bone. Okay, and cut.